The sun beat gently on the clay roofs of Umuagu, a quiet Igbo village nestled between winding streams and sacred groves. Long before the white man's ships appeared on the distant coasts, before missionaries, asphalt roads, and ballot boxes, the Igbo lived by the rhythm of nature and the decrees of the gods. In those days, the shrine was not merely a symbol of worship. It was the heart of the village, a place of justice, healing, guidance, and thanksgiving. And to these gods, people brought offerings, yams, kola nuts, goats, and sometimes people. It wasn't always blood sacrifice. Sometimes when misfortune visited a family again and again, or when someone committed a grave taboo that threatened the peace of the clan, the family would dedicate a relative, often a child, to the gods. It was seen as both restitution and protection. That person, once given, no longer belonged to the family or the community. They belonged to the deity, and so they were called Osu. To be Osu was to be sacred, set apart for divine purpose. They lived near shrines and served the spiritual realm. They lit ritual fires, swept the sacred grounds, and preserved taboos. In the early times, Osus were feared, respected, even honored. No one dared harm or defile them, for they were the possession of the gods. But slowly, over the generations, reverence turned into caution. Caution turned to suspicion, and suspicion hardened into rejection. The Osus, once sacred, became stained. Their homes were seen as polluted, their hands untouchable, their presence unwelcome. They became the people no one would marry, no matter how kind, beautiful, or accomplished. To mix with the Osu was to endanger one's lineage. The gods had not said this, the priests had not written it, but society decided, and society's judgment became law. Centuries passed and time's tide brought change. The British came. They drew lines on maps and imposed foreign codes of conduct. Christianity followed, preaching that all men were equal under God, but even the churches were not exempt. In many congregations, the Osu were not allowed to sing in the choir. In some, they were told to sit separately or were quietly asked to worship elsewhere. The law no longer recognized caste, but tradition still did. Children born Osu found themselves asking questions that had no answers. Like Nkemdilim, whose mother, Adaeze, was descended from a family that once dedicated a child to the goddess Ala Ogwugwu. Nkemdilim grew up curious, sharp-eyed, and warm-hearted. He had a gift for woodcarving and could make a flute out of bamboo in minutes. But there were games he couldn't join, friends who never invited him, and whispers that followed him like a shadow. He didn't know the full truth until he was 10. At the village stream, 2 women collecting water murmured behind cupped hands. "That's the Osu woman's son, the one with cursed blood." Nkemdilim didn't understand what they meant, but he felt it. He felt it in the way teachers skipped his name when choosing group leaders, in how the other children hesitated before taking food from his hand. He felt it most deeply when he fell in love. Her name was Chinelo, daughter of the village elder. She laughed with a joy that could calm thunder. When she smiled at him, Nkemdilim felt seen not as an outcast, not as a shadow, but as a person. They met in secret. They dreamed like young lovers do, but dreams die when tradition awakens. Chinelo's father summoned a gathering. He did not speak gently. "You will not stain my lineage," he declared to Nkemdilim's face with the son of an Osu. Chinelo's sobs could not move him. Neither could Nkemdilim's silence. The entire compound watched as a boy's hope was crushed beneath the weight of an identity he did not choose. And so Nkemdilim walked away, not just from Chinelo, but from his childhood, his innocence, and his right to belong. Years later, Amarachi, a school teacher in Nsukka, fell in love with Chike, a banker from Enugu. Educated, ambitious, and deeply in love, they believed they could rise above tradition. For 3 years, they built a life together. But when Chike brought her home to meet his family, joy turned to cold silence. "You did not ask her people's name?" his uncle asked. Chike nodded proudly. "She is from Umunze." The room fell quiet. The elders exchanged glances. His mother dropped her wrapper and began to wail. "Her people are Osu," she cried. Do you want to bring a curse into this house? No one remembered Amarachi's years of service in the community. No one asked if she prayed or fasted or gave to the poor. All they saw was her lineage. They never married. Amarachi returned to teaching, and Chike moved abroad. They loved, but they did not win. Even education, the great equalizer, could not undo the mark. Ifeani was brilliant, top of his class from primary to university. When he ran for student union president, he had no doubt he would win. But his opponent whispered to others, "He is Osu." That whisper spread like wildfire. Posters were torn down. Campaign managers resigned. One pastor even preached a sermon against him. He lost, not because of incompetence, but because of inheritance. Ifeani's dreams of entering politics were buried beneath the weight of stigma. When he tried to run for local office years later, the whispers came again. He wasn't even allowed to speak at the party meeting. "Even if Jesus endorses you," one chieftain laughed, "we cannot give power to an Osu." These were not isolated stories. They echoed across generations and geographies. In marriages denied, in friendships stifled, in lives unlived. Even after the Eastern Nigerian government abolished the Osu caste system in 1956, the mindset remained entrenched. The law changed, but the hearts didn't. Still, hope flickered. In some villages, brave traditional rulers held ceremonies where Diala and Osu danced and shared palm wine together. In others, churches publicly repented. Youths, unconcerned with their elders' fears, began to question the logic of inherited shame. Activists marched. Writers wrote. And then came Uzodinma Egekonye. He was not the first to speak, but he spoke with rare boldness. In 1999, he published Osus, The Victims of Igbo Culture, a piercing work of scholarship, testimony, and cultural defiance. He wrote about pain without flinching. He documented stories like Nkemdelim's. He called for introspection, not to destroy culture, but to redeem it. He reminded us, culture is not a god. It is a tool, and when a tool begins to harm its user, it must be reshaped. Uzodinma was criticized, called rebellious, but he stood firm. His pen did what swords could not. It cut through fear, shame, and silence. And now, as we remember him, we must also remember those he wrote for, the sons and daughters of the shrine, waiting to be seen, not as curses, not as outcasts, but as equals. The time has come to unlearn, to dismantle, to embrace, to ask not, is he Osu? But is he kind? Not where is she from, but who is she? This is the future Uzodinma dreamed of. A future where no child is born into rejection, where tradition bows to truth, and where humanity at last comes home. There was a boy named Ebuka, who lived in a village tucked between two winding rivers and a broken promise. His father, Okonkwo, had served in the Biafran army and returned home scarred by war. But even deeper than the bullet wound in his leg was the wound of being Osu, the title his family carried for generations. Ebuka grew up in silence, not because he had no words, but because he had learned early that words brought attention, and attention brought pain. At age 8, he tried to join the village masquerade festival. His friend Ikena whispered to him that it wasn't allowed. "My mother said I shouldn't play with you," he said softly, like he was sorry. She said, "You're different." That evening, Ebuka went home and asked his mother, "Are we different?" His mother looked away. She wanted to tell him no, but her heart knew better. Instead, she said, "You are special, but the world doesn't always see special the right way." So he grew up building his own toys, playing by the edge of the forest, and listening to stories from his grandfather, who once served as a shrine boy. "The gods don't hate you," the old man said one night, watching the moon. "People do." Ibuka's heart beat fast when he turned 16. He had met Adaugo, a girl from another village, who loved poetry and always wore a hibiscus flower in her hair. They met during a youth seminar organized by a church trying to end caste bias. There, under the wide mango tree, away from the whispers of elders, they spoke without fear. But freedom is often an illusion. When Adaugo's parents discovered their friendship, they confronted her with fire in their voices. "You want to destroy everything we've built?" her father asked. How dare you mix with an Osu? Adaugo ran from home that night. For days, no one saw her. The village searched. When they found her, she was by the riverside, soaked and silent, not harmed but broken. Her parents forbade her from seeing Ebuka again. They threatened to withdraw her from school. The pastor who had once welcomed Ebuka now called his parents aside.
"Let peace reign," he said.
There are many battles we cannot win. Ebuka didn't cry. He simply disappeared from the church, from the village, from himself. And yet, beyond the hills and the hate, something was changing. In Anambra State, a group of reformist chiefs convened a rare council. For the first time in living memory, Osu and Diala were seated in the same circle. One of the chiefs stood and poured libation, speaking words no one had ever heard. From the mouth of a leader, "Let the curse end. Let this land be free." The declaration spread like Harmattan fire. Some villagers mocked it, others ignored it, but some opened their gates. One of them was in Diovu, where Ngozi lived. Ngozi had never known she was Osu, until a suitor came with his uncles to knock on the door. After the kola nuts were broken and greetings exchanged, someone asked her family's lineage. When they answered, the silence that followed was deep. The suitor's uncle stood up and motioned for them to leave. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Ngozi's father broke down that night. "I should have told you," he said, "but I wanted you to live free, even for a while." The pain Ngozi felt was not just from rejection. It was from betrayal, from being kept in the dark, from knowing that love could be erased by something older than logic. She became restless, began reading, researching. That's how she found Uzodinma Egekonye's book. She read Osus, The Victims of Igbo Culture, in one sitting. The words burned through her like truth uncovered. He had written about her, about all of them. The pages spoke of injustice, but also of power. The power of knowing, the power of breaking silence, the power of remembering that to be Osu was once to be sacred. And so she began to write letters, posts, articles, poems. She joined a collective of young people across the southeast who were pushing for legal reform, demanding traditional councils sign public declarations. She visited villages, told stories, reminded people of their shared blood, their shared pain. Once in a gathering, an old woman stood up and said, "My daughter married an Osu boy last year. The earth has not split open. My yams still grow. Maybe it is time." One by one, voices like Ngozi's became louder, but not everyone welcomed the change. In Okija, an elder was quoted as saying, "The gods will punish those who try to remove the old ways." When Ngozi heard, she smiled sadly. "The gods," she replied in an interview, "are not as cruel as the people who claim to speak for them." She wasn't trying to erase culture. She was trying to resurrect its heart, because she believed, like Uzodinma did, that culture is not stone. It is clay, and clay can be reshaped. She visited the old Egekonye family house once, standing silently at the compound's entrance. The scholar had passed on, but his words lived. She whispered into the wind, "Thank you." Others had read the book too, politicians, teachers, pastors. Slowly, villages began organizing unity festivals, where Osu and Diala performed together, cooked together, danced together. Some towns now required premarital counseling that included sessions on caste history and trauma. A new curriculum was being developed to include the story of the Osu. Caste in schools, not to shame, but to teach. Change was coming, not like a hammer, but like a song. One voice, then another, then a chorus, and still it wasn't perfect. There were places where the word Osu was still spat like poison, where children were taught to fear the unpure, where girls like Adaugo still wept by riverside rocks. But the tide had shifted. Young people were refusing to inherit hate. Elders were beginning to apologize. Churches were repenting. Love was daring to cross lines again. And in the middle of it all, like a fire that refused to die, stood the legacy of Uzodinma Egekonye. He had dared to name the wound, and by naming it he gave us power. He reminded us that culture is only as strong as its compassion, that tradition is nothing without truth, and that every time we choose love over lineage, we honor not only the Osu, but ourselves. In the town of Umunse, an old man named Ofoegbu sat beside his dying brother, Idu. They had not spoken for years, not since Idu had married Neka, a woman descended from an Osu line. Their father had banished him. "We are Diala," he had said, "and Diala blood must remain clean." Idu, young and in love, left that day and never returned. Now, decades later, Idu lay on a straw mat, bones brittle, eyes sunken. Ofoegbu came not because tradition allowed it, but because time had humbled him. "Idu," he said, voice cracked like an old drum, "I came to say I was wrong." Idu blinked. A tear traced down the side of his weathered cheek. "I didn't understand back then," Ofoegbu continued. "I followed the rules of dead men, forgetting the heart of the living." Idu died the next morning, but with a smile. At his burial, both Osu and Diala came. For the first time in Umunzi's history, no one questioned it. No one stopped it. The priest simply said, "We return him to the earth." Not as an Osu, not as a Diala, but as a son of the soil. In the city of Onitsha, Uchechi Nwafo, a TG journalist known for her sharp tongue and bolder pen, aired a radio segment titled "The Last Caste." It opened with a chilling question. If the Osu are free, why are they still hiding? Calls flooded in. Some said, "Let sleeping dogs lie." Others said, "It is time we face our shame." But one woman's voice stood out. She said, "My son is 10. He doesn't know what Osu means, and I don't intend to tell him. Not because I'm hiding it, but because he is just a child. He deserves to be free. Let the past rot. I won't plant its seeds in him." That call went viral. Soon after, Uchechi began a campaign called "See Me Finish," a bold reclaiming of the shame once weaponized against Osu people. T-shirts, banners, and murals appeared across towns and campuses. One mural in Aba showed an Osu girl in traditional wrapper and beads, eyes fierce, arms raised high. Beneath it, the words, "I'm not your taboo. I am your mirror." Back in the university town of Nsukka, a quiet revolution was blooming inside lecture halls. Dr. Chidozie Amaka, an anthropologist and former student of Uzodinma Egekonye, had made Osus, the Victims of Igbo Culture, a compulsory reading for all students in his African ethics class. He opened each semester with a question scrawled on the board: "Who deserves rejection?" The class always fell silent. Then he would begin, not with theory, but with stories. The story of Uzodinma, how he gathered testimonies in secret, how some Osu families spoke only behind closed doors, how he was threatened for publishing truths others buried in shame. One year, a student named Somto stood up at the end of the semester and said, "Sir, my grandfather used to say Osus bring misfortune, but I think our silence is the real curse." Her words echoed long after the class ended. In villages where silence once reigned, public declarations now unfolded. In Imo State, a prominent traditional ruler, Igwe, Nanyarugo, held a gathering in the market square. Drummers played, elders stood. The people watched as he poured libation, not to beg the gods for mercy, but to ask for wisdom. "Today," he said, "I break a law that is not in any constitution, but lives in our bones. Today, we stop punishing children for the sins we invented." Women wept, men dropped to their knees. For many, it was the first time they had seen a leader unchain the past. But not all chains broke easily. In a quiet compound in Ibonyi, a girl named Osioma was forbidden from taking the lead role in a cultural dance because her grandmother had been Osu. The teacher, a woman old enough to know better, said, "We don't want to offend anyone." Osioma went home and told her father. He went straight to the school the next day and demanded a meeting with the principal, the teacher, and the school board. "My daughter is not cursed," he said, "but this school might be if you continue to teach children that being born is a crime." The teacher resigned weeks later. Osioma danced that year, somewhere in Delta State. A young man named Nwachinemelu decided he would run for state office. Everyone knew he was Osu. He made it part of his campaign. His posters read, "I was born Osu. I will lead as a human." He didn't win that year, but he placed second. And the people who voted for him were not Osu. They were just tired of lies. The next election, he won. When he gave his inauguration speech, he stood on the podium, voice calm but firm. I will build roads, yes. Schools, yes. Hospitals, yes. But most importantly, I will build something harder, dignity. And he did. As change swept across the region, elders who once upheld caste lines began passing away. Their sons and daughters stood at their funerals, making silent vows not to inherit their fears, not to pass them down. One such daughter was Oluchi, whose father had denied her sister's marriage because of Osu blood. When he died, Oluchi found the old marriage list in his drawer. She called the family. It's late, she said. But if she's still willing, we'd love to welcome her. They came, they danced, they wept. By the time the year turned, 10 more towns had signed abolition pledges. Churches began inviting Osu speakers to the altar. One sermon was titled, God has no grandchildren and no outcasts. And yet the fight continued, not against laws, but against the quietness in hearts, the hesitation, the lingering beliefs buried like seeds in the soil of fear. That was why the legacy of Uzodinma Egekonye mattered more than ever. His book wasn't just ink on paper. It was memory. It was a mirror. It was a battle cry. He had written about rejection, but he wrote with hope. He believed people could change, not all at once, but word by word, story by story, heart by heart. Today, when people speak his name, they do so with reverence, not because he was perfect, but because he was brave. And in the end, perhaps that is all that's needed. To be brave enough to speak, to be human enough to listen, to be free enough to choose love over fear, and to remember that those we once called Osu were never outcasts to the gods, only to us. But now we are learning to see again. In the dusty town of Isialangwa, there was a tailor named Chibuzor who sewed dreams into fabric. His hands were steady, and his eyes never missed a thread. He wasn't just known for the quality of his stitches, but for something less tangible, his kindness. Mothers brought him their daughters' wedding gowns. Grooms came with pride to be fitted for their big day. But when word spread that Chibuzor was Osu, the silence was louder than any denial. One by one, the customers vanished. The church that had once asked him to tailor priestly robes quietly withdrew its patronage. Even the chief, who had praised his craftsmanship the previous week, suddenly sent his guards to collect an unfinished agbada. It is better I go naked, he was said to have muttered, than wear the cloth of an Osu. Chibuzor wept that night, not for the loss of money, but for the unraveling of belonging. His cousin, Amarachi, refused to let it end there. She launched an online campaign with a simple message: the needle does not know caste. Photos of Chibuzor's work flooded social media. His suits, agbadas, and lace wrappers graced models and musicians. One day, a popular Afrobeat artist wore his design on stage and shouted, "Into the mic, Chibuzor made this, and if you have a problem with that, you are the one who's cursed." The crowd erupted. Orders poured in. But beyond the applause, Chibuzor smiled for a different reason. Not for validation, but for vindication. Even the winds were shifting in the halls of tradition. In the palace of Eze-Nwachukwu, a council was called to review the ancestral laws inscribed on goatskin scrolls. One passage, often cited to justify Osu separation, was read aloud. The eldest elder nodded slowly, then said, "But does the scroll speak louder than conscience?" Murmurs filled the room. Another elder stood and confessed, "My granddaughter is Osu. She brings me water. She rubs balm on my knees, and she is the only one who still calls me Papa. If the gods call her evil, then I no longer know what is good." There was silence, and then Eze-Nwachukwu said what no ruler had said in 300 years. If the gods cannot forgive, then they are not worthy of worship. That evening, the palace drummer played a rhythm no one had heard before. Slow, like tears falling. Steady, like healing. In faraway Lagos, where tradition often bows to city life, the story took a different shape. A podcast named Echoes of the Ancestors invited descendants of Osu lineage to share their experiences anonymously. One guest, who called herself Kamsi, told a story that shook listeners. She had gotten a job at a multinational company. She was brilliant, quick-witted, and led the team through their most successful quarter. Then one day, a fellow Igbo colleague overheard her speaking with her grandmother in their dialect. "You speak like someone from Nando," he said. She nodded. He asked her family name. She hesitated. The next week, whispers began. Her teammates grew distant. The promotion she had been promised disappeared. She didn't quit. Instead, she began to document it all. The microaggressions, the cold stares, the sudden exclusions. Her story went viral on LinkedIn. She titled the post, "I am not my ancestors' curse." The CEO of the company called her into his office the next day, not to fire her, but to apologize. "We didn't know," he said. She looked him in the eye and replied, "That's the problem. You never ask." The story made it to national TV. Debates sparked across dinner tables and churches. A panel of cultural scholars gathered to discuss the lasting legacy of caste systems across Nigeria. One of them, a young professor from Abia State University, ended the show with this line: "If culture forgets its humanity, it ceases to be culture. It becomes cruelty." In that same spirit, the National Orientation Agency released new civic education modules for schools. The Osu caste was no longer a footnote, it was a full chapter. Not to stigmatize, but to educate. To remind children that injustice often wears the mask of tradition. In Nsukka, a film club turned Uzodinma Egekonye's book into a stage play titled Salt in the Soil. The story followed two lovers, one Osu, one Diala, torn apart by family, only to reunite as elders and spark a village revolution. The final scene was haunting. The couple stood in front of a shrine, hands clasped, and said in unison, "Take your shame. We return it to you. It is no longer ours to carry." When the curtains closed, there was no applause, only tears. Back in Egekonye's hometown, a mural of his face was painted on the outer wall of the town library. Children walked by it every day, whispering his name like a prayer. Below the mural, a quote in Igbo read, "Akwakwakuru okwu umu akwakwa nanu." The book spoke. Let the children hear. And they did. Young people, now in their 20s, began to ask questions their parents avoided. They wanted to know why cousin Obinna was never invited to family gatherings, why Auntie Ngozi's wedding was boycotted, why Grandma still kept a separate dish for her Osu neighbor. And when the answers didn't make sense, they stopped listening. They started doing. One youth group from Enugu organized what they called a naming ceremony. But instead of naming children, they renamed the past. They took old caste slurs, wrote them on large paper sheets, and burned them in a calabash. One by one they said, "This name does not define me." Then they hugged Osu and Diala under the wide moon. But perhaps the most powerful moment came during a burial in Niwi. An old man named Chief Akubwezi had died. In his will, he made an unusual request, that his pallbearers include members of the Osu, family his ancestors had once shunned. The village was scandalized, but his children honored the will. As the coffin was lowered into the earth, a former Osu man named Mazi Ekene wept and said, "He made us carry him in death because he refused to carry hate in life." It was more than symbolism. It was absolution. By the time the year ended, 32 more communities had formally abolished caste-based exclusions. Some renamed their festivals. Others changed their bylaws. And yet others chose silence, but a silence born of surrender, not resistance. The book Uzodinma wrote continued to be passed from hand to hand, from mother to daughter, from teacher to student. Tattered copies lived in school libraries and underground archives. Each word bore weight, each sentence a stone in the building of justice. One day, at a writers' conference in Asaba, a panel was held in his honor. A woman stood up, holding her own worn copy of the book. Her name was Ezin. She had been born into Osu heritage, left Nigeria at 20, and returned now at 50 to tell her story. "I lived half my life abroad," she said, "but it was here in this land that I stopped hiding, because one man wrote what others were too afraid to speak." She held up the book. "This book made me human again." And in that moment, Uzodinma Egekonye lived again. Not in flesh, but in purpose, in truth, in change. The year was quiet in the way that only change can be, slow but certain, like the rising of dawn across a restless night. From Anambra to Abia, from Enugu to Ebonyi, the shift was not always loud. It did not always make the headlines, but it lived in the small, defiant choices of people who were tired of shame. In a Catholic church in Arochukwu, something remarkable happened. For decades, the communion line had two unspoken divisions, those who stood up boldly, and those who remained seated even when the Spirit moved. The Osu descendants knew their place. They had learned from whispers and sideways glances that unseen was safer. But on Easter morning, during the Mass, a woman named Obi stood up. She wasn't the oldest or the boldest, but she had just returned from the city after reading Uzodinma Egekonye's book. And she was done waiting. She rose, she stepped into the line, and behind her, slowly, like wind-waking leaves, others followed. 1, then 2, then 5. By the time the host reached them, there was no line left, just people, hungry for God, standing side by side. The priest didn't flinch, he smiled. And in that moment, perhaps for the first time, the altar belonged to everyone. Elsewhere, in a government building in Owerri, a policy memo was signed. It declared that all government forms, marriage registries, and public appointments must cease the practice of informal background lineage checks. No family names would be flagged, no heritage investigated. "We do not check bloodlines before we pave roads," the commissioner said. "Why then should we check them before giving dignity?" At the university in Nsukka, a sculpture was unveiled near the philosophy faculty. It was simple, a figure, neither male nor female, carved in bronze, arms stretched outward, unchained. At the base of the sculpture, a plaque read, "In honor of those once silenced, in memory of Uzodinma Egekonye, in defiance of fear, in praise of freedom." That sculpture became a gathering place. Students left flowers there on graduation day. Couples proposed there. Sometimes people just stood there in silence, letting the wind do the talking. Back in the village of Egekonye's birth, a foundation was launched in his name. Not a monument, not a statue, but something better. Scholarships for children of Osu, background books, mentorship, legal support. Every year, on the date of his book's publication, a lecture was held in his honor, open to all. No gate fee, no social separation. It was there, 10 years after his passing, that a girl named Amara Chukwu stood up during the Q&A session and said, "My mother burned this book when she found it in my room. She said it was dangerous, that it would make me rebellious. But I found another copy. I read it in secret, under my blanket at night. And it didn't make me rebellious. It made me brave." Applause thundered across the room. And somewhere, beyond the veil, beyond the earth and dust, Uzodinma smiled. But the story does not end with applause. It ends with choices. The choice to question what we've inherited. The choice to say enough, even when our voices tremble. The choice to welcome without inspection. The choice to remember that culture is a tool, not a weapon. The choice to rewrite the ending, even when the middle was painful. And so, the people of Igbo land began to remember differently. They remembered the shrines not with fear, but with context. They remembered the Osu not as cursed, but as carved, sculpted by pain. Yes, but also by resilience. They remembered that sacredness was never meant to imprison. It was meant to honor. And they remembered Uzodinma, not just as a writer, not just as a scholar, but as a prophet in a land too afraid of its own reflection. He had held the mirror, and now finally, the people were ready to look. To see what was broken, to see what could heal, to see one another fully, wholly human. And so the story ends, not with a funeral, but with a feast, not with silence, but with song, not with shame, but with grace. Because in every village where an Osu child now laughs without fear, in every family that welcomes love without questioning blood, in every school that teaches not what to fear but who to honor, there lives the spirit of Uzodinma. This story is not just history. It is memory. It is healing. In honor of Uzodinma Egekonye, who spoke truth when silence was safer, we remember the pain. We celebrate the courage. and we choose a new path forward. To every Osu child who has ever been told they were less than, you are not a curse, you are not a stain. You are not your lineage, you are loved. You belong, you matter. And to all of us, may we never again inherit hate in the name of tradition. This is Folktales by Fuzi, and today I lend my voice to the legacy of Uzodinma Egekonye. We will not forget, we will not remain silent, and together we will rewrite the story. Loved this story? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification button. Drop a heart in the comments if this touched you, and tell me, what kind of story should I tell next? Your idea could be my next upload. Thanks for tuning in.